Okay, well, let's continue our discussion about correspondence in the New Testament. And in this case, we're going to talk about the correspondence with the Corinthians. Okay, so pulling up our PowerPoint to discuss this further. We have looked at the correspondence with the Thessalonians, but let's look further at what we call the Corinthian correspondence. So we have multiple letters there, and we can actually use Paul's interaction with the Corinthians to help date Paul's ministry. So in Acts 18, remember in Acts 17, we could find Paul's interaction with the Thessalonians. In Acts 18, we find Paul then in the area of Corinth. And it discusses actually Paul being there. It talks about where he's at. He's being brought before a tribunal, which is kind of like a court. And we learn about a ruler there. Look at that. In verse 14, in verse 12 is introduced that he's a proconsul of that area. And then in verse 14, it mentions that he is like interacting with him. Well, we actually found an inscription nearby Corinth in a city named Delphi. And so here you see a picture of that. And that inscription actually has a date of the time during which Gallio ruled. Okay. Now it's not given in the numbers as we have, but we can kind of convert that and figure out that it's around the year 52. So that helps us kind of calibrate, if you will, Paul's ministry and his time there. So the Gallio inscription helps us calibrate, put precisely where it is, helps us work with the timeline of Paul. We can count backwards, we can count forwards. So then we have what we call the Corinthian correspondence. And we can use the letters that we have and the fact that we know from Acts when he is there to kind of reconstruct what we have. So Paul actually says that he received bad news from Corinth. So I put that here for you in this little circle, if you will. That just for clarity's sake, we're going to call Corinthians A rather than a letter with a number, because we already have that. Okay, so pulling this up, I'm actually reading this from my app, and we're going to go to 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9. So in verse 9, it says, this is Paul writing, I wrote to you all in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral persons. Well, he's writing that right here on my phone. He's writing that in the first letter to the Corinthians. So in that letter, he writes about another letter he wrote. So that's why we say Corinthians A. What about that bad news that he had received from there? He says in verse 11, I am now writing this to you. So that's kind of like there. When we go to 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 11, it actually says there, for it has been reported to me by Chloe's people that there are quarrels around you, among you all, my brothers and sisters. So he mentions that. So he receives bad news. He mentions that. Apparently there was some back and forth with Chloe in a letter, and then Paul responds. Now we don't know if there was even more in between, but this is the minimum of the information that we have. So he responds with yet another letter. If we keep up the A, B, C, D, E, F, we at least have A and B. But letter B, we think, is what we have as 1 Corinthians in the Bible. We learned that it was sent by his buddy Timothy. He travels with that, and that a visit by Paul is very much so in order, and that he refers to that as a sorrowful, a sad visit. So as a result, Paul then sends what he calls a painful letter, like it's tough to write. So we call that, to keep up the tradition, we call that letter C. We think of corresponds to what we call 2 Corinthians, the first part. Paul travels, he goes to Troas, which is the coast of Turkey. Then he goes to, then he travels inward, and he goes to Macedonia and Europe. And then he learns that really the community is responding to this. And then he sends news from Macedonia that we call Corinthians D. Now we have A, B, C, and D. And most people think that this is the second part of 2 Corinthians, and that some people think it's sent with Titus. So some people think it's two separate letters, like letter C and D. And other people think, no, it's one letter. It's all of 2 Corinthians. And it always was written in one sitting, or it was written over time, but sent together as one letter. Okay, but see how we can reconstruct that? Here it is in just like a bullet format. The same thing being told here. Some people find it easier to read it like that. Okay, so you can do some reconstruction exercises there. Now let's talk a little bit about 1st and 2nd Corinthians, like we did with Thessalonians, so we can kind of figure out when Paul is there and when he would be writing them, because he leaves Corinth and then writes back to them. It's undisputed. Paul writes it, written to Corinth. Most people think he writes from Ephesus, and he responds to very local issues. Okay, and so the purpose then is to deal with issues of disunity, where people are forming factions depending on where they are on issues, and really just giving advice to deal with these matters in the context of the culture surrounding that Jesus following community. So let's take a quick look at the first letter of the Corinthians. And remember, I just now read you from 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 11, where it talks about the bad news that he heard from Chloe. And the bad news actually is that people are forming allies. They're kind of like grouping off in different groups, where one group says, hey, I belong to Paul. I'm a follower. I'm a big fan of Apollos. I'm a fan of Cephas, which is Peter. And then you get the real spiritual people who are like, well, actually, I'm spiritual. I'm a follower of Jesus. And really, it's all over who is the wisest, which is not really a surprise, right? When you think about, they're in Greece. And in Greece, you have the Greek philosophers. And we're reading about that in the textbook, right? All these philosophers, and they're all pursuing wisdom. And so when the preachers come in and the Bible study leaders come in, they're one-upping each other in terms of who they think the wisest teacher is that they're following. It doesn't say that this is the claims of the leaders, but that's what the people are looking for. So you have some bragging rights when you go to work the next day, or you're talking at the stove in the middle of the town when you're baking bread. And so Paul says, oh, that's just disturbing. That's bad news. And he kind of pulls an ironic stunt here. He talks a little bit about it, and he says, let me tell you this. Let's just cut to the chase. You can one-up each other all day long about who is the wisest, who's the best teacher, but here's God's wisdom. God's wisdom is foolishness to the world. God's wisdom is a crucified Messiah. You never saw it coming. God's wisdom is someone who came to rescue a people and did so in the most shameful sort of way. Now take that back. So Paul is actually being funny. Then for a bunch of chapters, Paul actually deals with a lot of local issues, very practical. Apparently they have some stuff going on. If you read 1 Corinthians chapter 5, it reads like a bad reality show. It's sexual morality. It talks about, he says, I've heard it that you have a person who is still sleeping with his stepmom. Whoa. This is when I'm like, don't just hand the Bible to your little 6-year-old who just can read. You may want to do some guided reading, right? You're talking about lawsuits, eating with philosophies behind it, how to relate to culture, asceticism. Okay, look up what asceticism means. This idea that the spiritual is overemphasized and the material is evil, which can either mean that you're depriving yourself or you turn to some form of hedonism. So that's like chapter after chapter. Yeah, so here you have it. It's actually reported that there's such a sexual immorality among you. And he says, pagans don't even do it. A man is living with his father's wife. Do not even eat with such a one. Don't fellowship with that person. Oh. In 1 Corinthians 7, you get really to a core. Paul wants to be interacting and answering questions. Now, remember, this is not the first letter. He deals with issues of marriage and divorce and being single. And it's just widows. It just goes on. And the question then is, are these like words of wisdom for everyone at all times? Or is this a word of wisdom for the particular situation rising in Christian fellowships in Corinth? Like, do you give the same piece of advice today to a church in somewhere in Bombay as you give to a church in Seattle, as you give to a church somewhere out here in the country, here in Texas? Probably not. It doesn't mean that you're going to say something different about who Jesus is, but how you practically go about stuff, it needs finesse, okay? So it's couched in that culture. And in that chapter, Paul says, I just wish that people were as I am, and it says that you would remain unmarried. Whoa! So does that mean that Paul puts singleness as favorable over being married? Now, in some points, he says, he makes some practical points. He says, once you're married, you're just kind of usurped. You're kind of busy with everything else in life. Here you see, this is one of my wedding pictures. It's a long time ago. It's actually a picture in the Netherlands on a boat there. Well, based on that, one could wonder, was Paul married? Was Paul always single? Well, if you remember Paul's background, his rabbinic background, he was a way high up Jewish leader. People of that capacity, members of the council, they typically were always married. It's actually very likely, more likely than not, that Paul for sure was married. Well, let's think about that then. Now, what happened? He does say in 1 Corinthians 7 that he is single at that time. So what could have happened? Well, he could have lost his wife. He could be a widower. Remember, life expectancy was low. One of the primary causes of early death for ladies would have been death in childbirth. One of the primary causes of death for men were accidents, death in war, early diseases. I don't know if any of you are pre-dental students, but I learned that a lot of people had abscesses in the mouth and they would go to the brain and you're gone. And so much would happen. So the average lifespan was somewhere around 40 or so. Isn't that just astounding? And so, with that in mind, what could have happened, right? So he could have lost his wife to death or in childbirth. It's also possible that Paul was divorced. Think about his change in his life's career. He has this encounter on the Damascus road, and he changes direction. Now, when Paul, think about his timeline, when Paul came to Jerusalem, his parents relocated their family for the very purpose of having their young male child enter into training to become a rabbi. Now, in that time and in that culture, that often did not just concern the nuclear family, but the extended family. Everyone contributes. It's such an honor to relocate a devout family from the basin of Asia, from Tarsus, all the way to Jerusalem, so they can facilitate that study for Paul. And then Paul abandons that life of zeal. He doesn't abandon being Jewish, but the zealousness of it, and says, I've found the Messiah, and here's how we want to go about it. That's reason for divorce. Now remember, ladies could not request a divorce in a Jewish community, but their fathers could, their older sons could, their brothers could, and often that would mean that they would request any children also to be appointed to them. So maybe he was divorced. Whatever it was, I think Paul identifies with pain when it comes to this. So yeah, a lot of different issues being discussed here in a very practical manner. Some of the verses that follow, they're rather unclear. If you keep going, it has to do with worship and how they go about doing church. At one point, it says, for this reason, there's a long run up. You can just read that in 1 Corinthians 11. It says the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Whoa, very unclear. Now, I do a little bit of handstands, and I can give you what I think the reading is, right? But when you read different scholars, different commentaries, there's a diversity of opinions of what that might mean. And I always get a little bit nervous when I hear some pastor or some teacher go, this is exactly what it means. No, we don't know what it exactly means. We may have an inclination of thinking what it might mean, but the verse is unclear. So let me give you a guideline of what people who study interpretation give as a general rule. In general, put clear verses over unclear verses. So if something is unclear, you don't want to bank on that, how you behave as a follower of Jesus. Go to the clear verses. And I would say go to the life of Jesus. So we have very many of these unclear verses here. Here's another one. Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. Really? Wow. So if people have a situation or just natural inability to grow hair long, inability, then she doesn't have glory? Did God make a mistake when some women cannot grow their hair long? And is it abhorrent when men have long hair? Hey, I grew up in the 80s and 90s and men looked nice with long hair. Is that really that bad? So again, verses are unclear because there's a context here. And Paul is saying something to a situation going on. And remember, this is correspondence. We don't have the letter that came before. We have not set in on these back and forth conversations. When Paul had visits, when he learned from Chloe and the people, we are stepping in to an ongoing social media conversation, and some parts have completely been deleted and we don't understand the culture. So we better not bank our Christian lifestyle and the things that we tell other people Christianity stands for on these kind of verses. Let's just get a general feel for the letter. So remember that one of the main concerns was disunity. Paul says, people are just following different people, that they say focuses more on wisdom, and then people are divided over the stuff that's going on. And he says, so here's what you probably should do. Why don't you come together around what we believe about Jesus. After all, we're Jesus followers. So when it comes to chapter 15, he says, look, this is what it's all about. So this is the foundation of the letter. And some people say this is kind of like a statement of the church to believe in, a creedal statement. So in verses 3 to 8, he says, listen, we can all agree on the fact that Jesus died. He just died for sins. That he was buried, he physically died, and then he physically rose. And people have seen him. Okay, why don't you? It's kind of like when you have a couple that run into difficulties, provided there's no abuse. Sometimes it's good to find out what you have in common. What attracted you to this person in the first place? And here, what do we have in common? What drew us to follow Christ? Let's remember what Christ stands for. And this is that early confession. Well, correspondence continues. Letters A, B, C, maybe even D. So 2 Corinthians, look at this. This is a canal that people dug out in Corinth. 2 Corinthians continues to provide guidance. That's all it is. I find it very encouraging because rather than Paul saying, do I have to keep writing letters to convince you? No, he has a tone of hope and forgiveness. He says, our hope for y'all is unshaken. And if forgiveness has to happen, if I have to forgive anybody, and he models that. I love that, really, about that. And so that's kind of the stuff that we can learn from looking at the correspondence. All right.